Welcome to Bay Area Psychology. Tonight's focus on domestic violence was, surprisingly enough, not triggered by the O.J. Simpson case, but by a tragedy closer to home, the double shooting of Stacey Hoffman and Christopher Pena. 2 months after Chris had pled no contest to punching Stacey and repeatedly threatening her life, she bought him a semi-automatic rifle for his birthday. On March 7, Chris used this same rifle in the aftermath of a heated argument to kill Stacey and then took his own life. Despite a restraining order barring Chris from Stacey, they had shared an apartment for almost 6 months. In the wake of their deaths, questions arose about the value of restraining orders and battered women's participation in the cycle of violence. Police wondered if anything could have prevented these killings. I wish this was a tragedy because of the uniqueness of this case. In fact, the FBI estimates that one woman is beaten by her husband or partner every 15 seconds in the United States. Tonight, we'll look at the cycle of violence and address the question, why do people stay in abusive relationships? We are very fortunate to have with us the colorful and articulate Deputy District Attorney, Ms. Rolanda Pierre-Dixon. Also with us is Kathy Ann Good from the local San Jose treatment program Next Door. Welcome. Welcome to both of you. I'm glad you could join us this evening. I don't know if you are familiar with the case I referred to, but I imagine, if not this specific case, you have probably heard this story before.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I definitely read about this particular case because part of what I do is look at deaths in the county and the surrounding counties to see if they're domestic violence related, and then to form some ideas myself in terms of what I do on my own job. This particular case was in a different county. The scary part about it is, yes, this was an educated woman, a young woman, someone who the whole community thought had their head on straight, would never have been the victim of domestic violence, and yet we know as workers in this domestic violence area that it does not matter what one's racial background is, what one's socioeconomic status is. You can be the victim of domestic violence. You can be very smart on the outside, appear to have it all together, and yet go home to an abusive relationship. What caused this situation to happen? She was caught up in a cycle of violence and could not get out. Why would she buy him a weapon? Because he couldn't buy it himself. According to California law, if you're subject to a restraining order, there is a 10-year period that you cannot buy a weapon, and that can be checked. So of course she had to go, and he said, you go get it, and she did it. Letting him come back in, we see it all the time. You know,
Kathy, I'm sure you've experienced that, where women will come to your center and begin to make some efforts, even maybe filing a restraining order, and then perhaps make a decision to return.
Yes, I've worked in the restraining order clinic at Next Door Solutions to Domestic Violence. It's something that we talk to the women about all the time. The restraining order is only as good as you make it.
Okay.
You have to participate in this. It's not just a piece of paper that you carry around. You have to be vigilant about it.
And I imagine that sustaining that vigilance over time probably gets pretty wearing.
It's very difficult. I've met women who have carried those pieces of paper with them wherever they go, and others who say, well, it's just too difficult. He wants to come and see the children. He brought me flowers. He brought me candy. How could I keep the door shut?
Okay.
Love is all tied up in this. And denial.
And denial, yes.
And what we tell, and what I tell victims all the time is, you've gone to court, you've proven to a judge or to a magistrate that you are so fearful of this individual that if they even came within 100 yards of you, you would be afraid. If you prove that to a judge, then you must maintain that particular fear at all times, even when they're coming, even when they're nice. And remember that a lot of incidents of violence began with him being very nice, and then things turned ugly. So don't let him come sometimes and then want the law enforced at other times. Enforce it every single time. And if you're not getting what you need when you call the police department, you can call and ask to speak to a sergeant, get that case to the DA's office, and in my opinion and in my position as the person that brings those charges, I will bring charges for violation of restraining order.
And many times the batterer works through the children. I want to see my children. They're my children too. I love them as much as you do. Come on, just let me come in tonight. Or he'll call the children and say, I'm coming over. I want to see you. It's been a long time. And works that way to try to get in and beat the restraining order.
Let's take a look. You both have mentioned or alluded to this cycle that begins to happen. We have a graphic, our cycle of violence, and I thought we'd take a look at the 3 stages that are traditionally talked about, originally described by Lenore Walker. The first of these tends to be stage 1, tension. In the middle we have denial, control, power issues. What can you tell us about this tension phase of this cycle?
It really depends on the couple, but obviously what you're talking about is a catalyst. The defendant may have had a bad time at work that day. A close family member may have died. He may not have liked the way someone looked at you. Whatever it is, that tension begins to build. And the victim, the person that is going to be the one beaten, doesn't have any control over that. And that's unfortunately what a lot of victims don't realize. They think somehow if I'm more perfect, if I were prettier, if I were thinner, if I didn't argue back, all of this would stop right now. That I help exacerbate the situation by building the tension. That tension comes from within the batterer.
And my understanding is part of the denial that happens is that she might say, or he might say, well, gee, you know, these incidents only happen a few times a year. So this tension phase we're referring to could potentially be over a period of weeks or months. Has that been your experience?
And she can feel it. Sometimes she can feel it coming. And as she feels it coming closer and closer, she tries to become more and more perfect. The house will look good. The children will be dressed a certain way. Everything will be perfect for him. And she can never be perfect enough.
Okay. This reminds me actually of something very similar with small children who are in abusive situations.
Yes.
Which is that their way of coping with their fear is, if somehow this is my fault, somehow I'm going to be able to change the situation.
That's right.
So the actual fear has to do with recognizing the powerlessness of being in that position. Is that something
that's
you've seen?
exactly it. And when that tension starts to build, she has to realize there is nothing she can do to stop the ultimate battering situation other than to get out. And this is what I try to stress to victims more and more and more. You cannot control another human being. That person has to control themselves. But you can control your own self by removing yourself from the situation. Don't sit there and pretend that you're going to be able to intervene. You haven't been able to do it in the past, and without some outside intervention, you will not be able to do it this time.
Okay. So thinking to herself, well, maybe this time it will be different.
That's right.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there's a lot of denial tied up with all of this. This can't really be happening to me. Rolanda and I were just talking about this out in the lobby. I'm a professional person. I'm a teacher. I'm a lawyer. This couldn't be happening to me. This isn't domestic violence because I'm a professional person and so is he.
Okay.
And I love him.
Okay, so we have some real stereotypes about who it is that actually participates. Now, the next phase in our cycle was the explosive stage. This is the point where violence actually takes place.
Right.
And this violent incident, I've had clients say to me, it's not like it's domestic violence. I mean, it was a shove.
Oh, sure.
He just slapped me. I didn't need medical treatment. So I guess defining violence, both from a legal standpoint and a clinical, would be very helpful for us.
Well, legally, when I look at domestic violence cases, a battery is unconsented to touching. So what I explain to victims is any touching, that push, that shove, that case can be actionable and I can bring charges. Obviously, by the time the police are called, oftentimes we have an actual injury. And the injury can be anything, from reddening of the skin all the way up to obviously a trip to the hospital, sutures or something of that nature. But domestic violence is not just a situation where the person ends up in the hospital. Domestic violence is a situation where someone is using their physical power over you to control you. And if that's pushing and shoving, we can do something about it. The law has gone even one step further 2 years ago by adding 422 of the Penal Code, which talks about threats to your life. So now even verbal threats of death can be actionable. And victims need to act because that is battering, that is domestic violence.
We also teach that battering isn't just physical, it's emotional. When you're called names, when you're told you're worthless, that you can't get along without him, that's a form of battering. We also talk about financial control. That goes hand in hand with it. Emotional, psychological. Also, the batterer can threaten to do violent acts to objects that she loves. For example, if she has a piece of jewelry, we talked about that this morning in a group I was with. If she has one piece of jewelry that he loves, that she loves, and he flushes it down the toilet. That is a key to it.
Okay, so I think you're bringing up an interesting point, which is the first act of violence is not usually, it can be, but not usually a direct physical contact.
That's right.
My experience clinically is that people start out more with emotional violence. That maybe the couple starts out with verbal exchanges and ridicule and shaming, and it escalates from there.
And it does, and that's why I have the philosophy I do and the policy I do, that I want to issue criminal counts at the lowest stage that I can get the case. If I can get a case where it's pushing and shoving, I will issue that 242, which is a battery. If I get it with reddening of the skin, I will issue a misdemeanor 273.5, which is that condition which requires some injury, because I want to get intervention as soon as I can. If I sit around and say, gee, it wasn't that big a deal, as many victims will tell me later, I'm not going to do anything, then I'm waiting until she's either in the hospital or she's dead. And then I think it's a little bit too late.
Yes, it is. And I imagine I think you've told me before that that has changed, where the victim can no longer recant the charge, that you actually make the decision, or your office makes a decision whether to proceed or not. Because I know that's been a long-term complaint from police departments and the legal system, which is we go out, we make the arrest, we do the processing, and then she says or he says, I don't want to pursue this.
Right.
That's exactly true. So we have a no-drop policy. It was the first one we instituted in 1990 with the unit. And that means if she calls up or he calls up a day or two later, depending on who the victim is, even though 95% of the time the victim is a woman in this county, and says, I don't want anything done, I slipped, I fell, he's Mr. Wonderful. Thanks for telling me all that, but the charges have been brought. It is the state of California versus this defendant. They will not be dropped.
Okay. We're going to need to take a break here for a moment. When we return, we will hear your perspective on why people stay in abusive relationships. Stay with us. Okay, why do you think people stay in violent situations?
I think there's several reasons. Sometimes women in particular stay in violent situations because they don't know any different. I think that I've seen a lot of that in areas that are small towns where that seems to be very prevalent. Other times I think that they think it's a challenge. They can change this person, and to be complete within their lives, they want to stay and make a change. They don't want to leave. Other people close their eyes and just don't see the violence. They tend to want to forget it. So therefore the violence isn't there for them.
Do you think people stay in abusive situations?
I have seen a couple of cases